The summons came without warning on a morning that seemed like any other. And Juncio found himself escorted not to the Queen's private chambers, but to the great throne room where formal court was held. He had never been to this place before, and the scale of it stole his breath. The chamber rose upward for hundreds of meters, its walls alive with bioluminescent patterns that told the history of the Velothi, people in colors and shapes that his human eyes could barely comprehend. And thousands of courtiers filled the space in perfect, geometric arrangements that spoke of ceremonies rehearsed over countless generations. Representatives from every noble house stood in their designated positions, their compound eyes fixed on the entrance, where Juncio appeared flanked by soldiers in the most elaborate ceremonial armor he had yet seen. The walk to the center of the chamber felt like it took hours, and every step brought new awareness of just how many eyes were watching him, just how many of the galaxy's most powerful individuals had gathered to witness whatever was about to happen. Queen Velothric sat upon a throne that seemed to grow from the living walls of the palace itself, and beside her stood Princess Kethrial in formal robes that made her look older and more regal than Juncio had ever seen her. But when Kethrial's eyes found his across the vast distance of the chamber, she smiled, and she was once again the child who begged him for stories about dogs and pizza and the blue skies of Earth. Juncio was positioned in the center of the chamber, surrounded by witnesses from every corner of Velothi civilization. And the queen rose from her throne to address the assembly. "We gathered today to address a matter of honor and debt," she announced, and her voice carried to every corner of the vast space without apparent effort. 7 months ago, my youngest daughter was trapped in a collapsed tunnel on a mining colony at the edge of our territory, and she would have died if not for the actions of the human who stands before you now. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Juncio felt the weight of thousands of gazes pressing down upon him. Park Juncio of Earth gave my daughter his breath when hers failed, the queen continued. He dug through poison rock with his bare hands until they bled. He carried her to safety while his own body failed from toxic exposure. And he did all of this for a child he did not know, a child of a species not his own, a child whose survival offered him nothing but the satisfaction of having done what was right. The chamber fell silent, and the silence was heavier than any sound. "Our laws demanded that he be brought here," the queen said. "Our traditions demanded that he remain until the debt was satisfied. And for 7 months, he has lived among us as an honored prisoner, bound by customs he did not choose and laws he did not make." She descended from her throne, and the courtiers drew back as she walked toward Juncio with slow, deliberate steps. "I have spent these 7 months trying to find a way to repay the debt," she said. "I have consulted our oldest laws and our wisest scholars. I have searched for precedents and histories that stretch back thousands of years. And I have failed." Juncio's heart sank, because failure to find an answer meant continuation of his captivity, meant more years in a gilded cage, no matter how comfortable or how kind his captors had become. "No treasure we possess can equal my daughter's life," the queen continued. "No title we could grant, no honor we could bestow, no gift in all our vast empire can balance the scales of this debt." She stopped before him, and for the first time since he had met her, she seemed uncertain. "But in my search for answers, I realized something that our ancient lawmakers never considered," she said. "I realized that the debt is not mine to repay." The crowd stirred with confusion, and Juncio felt his own bewilderment growing. "The debt belongs to my daughter," the queen said. "It is her life that was saved, and it is she who owes the debt. And she's a child." She turned to look at Kethrial, who had left her position beside the throne and was now standing just a few steps behind her mother. "Children do not understand debts and honor and ancient law," the queen said. "They understand simpler things, truer things. And when I asked my daughter how she wished to repay the human who saved her life, she gave me an answer that I could not argue with. Kethrial stepped forward and took Junseo's hand in two of her own. "I want him to be my brother," she said, and her voice rang clear and strong through the silent chamber. "I want him to be family. I want him to stay not because he has to, but because he wants to. And I want him to be free to leave whenever he chooses, because that is what family means." The courtiers erupted in chaos, voices rising in protest and confusion and outrage, because what the princess was proposing violated every tradition and precedent and established law. The queen raised one hand, and silence fell like a blade. "My daughter proposes that Park Junseo be adopted into the royal clan as her brother," she said, "not as a symbol or a gesture, but as legal truth recognized by every court and authority in our empire." She turned to face the assembly, and her voice carried a challenge that dared anyone to object. "Family may come and go as they please," she said. "Family is not bound by debt or obligation or ancient law. Family is bound by love and choice, and the decision to remain together despite having the freedom to be apart." She looked at Junseo, and he saw in her 6 ancient eyes a question that went deeper than ceremony or tradition. "What say you, Park Junseo?" she asked. "Will you accept this adoption? Will you become brother to my daughter and son of my house? Will you accept freedom that comes with the understanding that you will always have a home here if you choose to return?" Junseo looked at Kethrial, who was gripping his hand with desperate hope, and he looked at the queen, who had found a way to break chains that had bound her people for millennia. And he understood finally what he was being offered, not just freedom, but family, not just release, but belonging. "Yes," he said, and the word echoed through the chamber like the beginning of something new. "I accept." The ceremony that followed was ancient and beautiful and filled with harmonics that made Junseo's bones vibrate. And when it was complete, he was no longer a prisoner, or a guest, or an anomaly. He was family. "I will go to Earth," he told the queen after the ceremony had ended and the courtiers had departed in states, ranging from shock to reluctant acceptance. "I have family there who need to know I am alive. I have affairs that need to be settled and people who deserve to see my face again." "Of course," the queen said, and there was no hesitation in her voice. "A ship will be prepared for you. Take whatever time you need, but I will return," Junseo continued. And he felt Kethrial's arms tighten around his waist where she had attached herself since the moment the ceremony ended. "Because my sister needs someone to teach her about dogs and pizza and soccer, and because her mother needs someone who sees her as a person rather than a crown." The queen's compound eyes flickered with something that might have been tears if Velothi had tear ducts. "You changed us," she said quietly. "You changed my daughter, and you changed me, and you changed laws that have stood for 10,000 years. And all you did was be kind. Kindness is not a small thing," Junseo said. "On my world, we have a saying that kindness is the one investment that never fails." 3 months later, he stood in the palace gardens, teaching Kethrial a clapping game that his grandmother had taught him on lazy summer afternoons in a small apartment on Earth. The queen watched from a balcony above, her massive form still and regal, but with something almost soft in the way she held herself. A human had come to save a child, and he had stayed to change an empire. And in the end, the chains that bound them all had been broken not by force or politics or revolution, but by the simple radical act of treating others with compassion. Kethrial laughed as she finally mastered the pattern of the game, and her laughter echoed through gardens that had never heard such sound. And somewhere in the palace, servants paused in their work to smile at the strange and wonderful future that was unfolding around them. This was how change happened. Not in grand gestures, but in small moments of connection. Not through power, but through love. Not by demanding freedom, but by creating families that made freedom possible. And Park Jun-seo, brother to a princess and son of an empire, former prisoner and forever family, thought that perhaps this was the best ending he could have hoped for. Not an ending at all, really, but a beginning. 6 months passed on the throne world of Kethvaros, and Park Jun-seo learned that adaptation was something humans did better than almost any other species in the galaxy. He learned the Velothi language, not through formal instruction, but through necessity and stubbornness and the endless patience of a child who wanted desperately to communicate with her strange, soft friend. From the stars, he learned the rhythms of the palace, the unwritten rules that governed who could speak to whom and when and about what. And he learned to navigate the complex social hierarchy without causing offense or embarrassment. He learned which foods would nourish his human body and which would make him ill. And he learned to appreciate the alien beauty of the gardens where he was permitted to walk under careful supervision. But most importantly, he learned that he could not stop being who he was just because the circumstances of his life had changed. The maintenance engineer inside him looked at the palace and saw systems that needed attention, saw inefficiencies that could be corrected, saw small problems that would become large problems if left unaddressed. When he found a broken lighting fixture in a corridor that the servants used, he fixed it with tools borrowed from a confused maintenance worker who had never seen a corner scene. Human request access to a utility closet when he discovered that the water recycling system in his section of the palace was operating below optimal efficiency. He spent 3 days studying the schematics until he understood how it worked. And then he made adjustments that improved output by 12%. Word spread through the palace staff that the human prisoner was strange. He did not act like other prisoners, did not rage against his captivity, or plot his escape, or sink into despair and bitterness. Instead, he wandered the permitted areas of the palace and asked questions and learned names and remembered birthdays and fixed things that were broken. The servants did not know what to make of him at first, because in their experience, important prisoners were either dangerous or pathetic. And Jun-seo was neither. He was kind. When a young guard named Theskai lost her clutch sister to a sudden illness, Jun-seo found her crying in an empty corridor and sat with her in silence for 3 hours, offering nothing but his presence and his willingness to share her grief. When an elderly servant named Krilveth struggled to carry supplies up a long staircase because his joints were failing with age, Jun-seo took the burden from him without being asked and made the climb twice each day, until the palace administrators assigned younger workers to the task. When the child of a cook fell ill with a fever that the medical staff could not explain, Jun-seo remembered that human viruses sometimes affected other species in unusual ways, and he volunteered samples of his blood for testing, and the doctors found the answer and saved the child. He did not do these things to earn freedom or favor or advantage. He did them because they needed to be done and because he was capable of doing them. And this confused the Velothi more than anything else about him. Princess Kethrael visited him every day without fail, bringing her lessons and her games and her endless questions about Earth and humans and the universe beyond her throne world. She learned to play rock, paper, scissors, and tic-tac-toe, and a dozen other simple games that Jun-seo remembered from his childhood. And she taught him Velothi games in return, and their laughter echoed through corridors that had not heard such sounds in generations. The guards assigned to watch Jun-seo began to relax around him, began to speak to him as something closer to a colleague than a captive. And through them he learned about Velothi families and dreams and fears and hopes. He was still a prisoner. The locks on his door still engaged every night, and his movements were still restricted to certain areas of the palace. But the bars of his cage had become invisible to everyone except the laws that demanded they exist 6 months after his arrival. The Queen summoned him to a private audience. She received him in a small chamber rather than the vast throne room, and she dismissed her attendants so that they were alone except for the ever-present guards who stood so still they might have been statues. "I have been watching you," the Queen said, and there was something in her voice that Junseo had not heard before, something that might have been confusion or respect or both. "I have received reports from my staff about your behavior, and I confess that I do not understand you." "What is there to understand?" Junseo asked. "I am simply trying to be useful. That is exactly what I do not understand," the Queen replied. "You are a prisoner here, held against your will by laws you did not choose and customs you do not share. And yet you show no resentment. You treat my servants with respect. You have become beloved by my household staff, and you make my daughter laugh in ways she has not laughed since before the accident. Should I be bitter instead?" Junseo asked, and the question was genuine rather than challenging. "Would that improve my situation or bring me closer to freedom?" "Most prisoners would not ask that question," the Queen said. "Most prisoners do not think about improving their situation through acceptance and kindness. Most prisoners fight and scheme and rage against their circumstances until the circumstances break them." "I thought about fighting," Junseo admitted. "In the beginning, I thought about escape plans and demands and threats. But then I watched you rule, and I saw how heavy the crown sits upon your head. And I realized something that changed everything." The Queen leaned forward, her 6 eyes burning with intensity. "What did you realize?" she asked. "That you are as much a prisoner as I am," Junseo said. "You are bound by the same laws and customs that bind me. You did not choose to keep me here any more than I chose to stay. And you carry the weight of traditions that were ancient before your great-grandmother was born." The Queen was silent for a long time, so long that Junseo began to wonder if he had caused offense in all my years of rule. She said finally, "No one has ever seen that truth so clearly. My advisors speak of tradition as though it were sacred and unchangeable. My courtiers speak of law as though it were wisdom incarnate. But you, a human prisoner who has been here for only 6 months, you see the chains that I have worn my entire life." "I am sorry," Junseo said. "I did not mean to cause pain." "You did not cause pain," the Queen replied. "You named a pain that has always existed. And there is something liberating in having one's wounds acknowledged by another." The door burst open and Kethrial rushed in, her forearms reaching for Junseo before she even registered her mother's presence. "You promised to tell me more stories about Earth today," she demanded, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the door. "You promised to teach me about the animals called dogs, and the food called pizza, and the game called soccer." Junseo looked at the Queen, expecting anger at the interruption, but what he saw instead made him pause. The Queen was watching her daughter with an expression that transcended species, an expression that any parent in any corner of the galaxy would recognize instantly. It was love, pure and uncomplicated and fierce, and it was mixed with something else, something that looked very much like hope. "Go," the Queen said, and her voice was softer than Junseo had ever heard it. "My daughter has been waiting all day, and I would not want her to think that queens are more important than promises." Kethrial dragged Junseo from the chamber, chattering about dogs and pizza and all the wonders of Earth she had yet to learn. And behind them, the Queen sat alone in the empty room and thought about chains and traditions and the strange human who had somehow begun to change everything. The throne world of Kethvaros was nothing like Junseo had imagined, and he had spent the entire 3-week journey imagining, because there was little else to do aboard the royal vessel except eat the strange food they provided and wonder what fate awaited him at the end of the voyage. He had expected something cold and alien and terrifying, And instead he found a world of impossible beauty. The hive cities rose toward the amber sky like sculptures carved by artists who had never learned the meaning of limitation. Their spires twisting in patterns that seemed to defy physics while simultaneously honoring some mathematical principle his human mind could not grasp. Gardens filled the spaces between the towers, and the plants that grew there produced flowers in colors that Earth had no names for. And creatures that were not quite insects and not quite birds moved through the branches singing songs that his translator could not interpret. Juncio was escorted from the landing platform by a dozen soldiers in ceremonial armor, and crowds of Velothi citizens lined the walkways to watch him pass, their compound eyes tracking his every movement with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He was an oddity here, a curiosity, a strange soft creature from a distant world who had somehow stumbled into the center of galactic politics through an act of simple human decency. They brought him to the palace, and the palace made the hive cities look modest by comparison. It rose from the heart of the capital like a mountain that had been hollowed out and filled with light, and the walls were alive with bioluminescent patterns that shifted and changed as Juncio walked through the endless corridors. He expected to be brought before the queen immediately, but instead the soldiers stopped at a massive door that opened onto a chamber filled with Velothi courtiers in elaborate ceremonial dress. At the center of the chamber, surrounded by attendants and guards, and what appeared to be tutors, was the child he had saved. Princess Kethriel saw him before the courtiers could announce his presence, and what happened next would become legendary in the centuries that followed. She ran. She ran across the polished floor with her 4 legs pumping and her damaged wings fluttering uselessly behind her. And she ran past the scandalized courtiers who tried to intercept her. And she ran directly into Juncio's legs and wrapped all 4 of her arms around him and held on as though she never intended to let go. "You came," she said, and her voice was high and musical and filled with a joy that needed no translation. "Mother said you would come, but I was afraid. I was afraid you would not want to see me again. I was afraid I had caused you too much trouble." Juncio looked down at the child clinging to him, and he saw the healing cracks in her chitin and the damaged membranes of her wings that would never fly again. And he felt something shift in his chest. "Of course I came," he said. And he placed his hand on her head in a gesture that felt natural, even though he had never touched a Velothi before the day he saved her life. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." The courtiers were making sounds of horror and outrage, and the soldiers were moving forward as though uncertain whether they should separate the princess from the alien who was touching her. And the chaos continued until a single harmonic note cut through the noise and silenced everyone. Queen Velathrix stood in a doorway that had not been there a moment before, and her presence filled the chamber the way light fills a dark room. "Leave us," she said. And the courtiers and soldiers and attendants fled like leaves before a wind until only the queen and the princess and Juncio remained. Kethriel did not release her grip on Juncio's legs, and the queen made no move to separate them. "My daughter has spoken of nothing but you since she recovered," the queen said, and she moved closer with a grace that seemed impossible for a creature of her size. "She has told me about the human who gave her his breath and dug through poison rock with his bare hands and carried her to safety, while his own body failed around him. I only did what needed to be done," Juncio said. "Yes," the queen replied. "And that is why you are here." She gestured, and servants appeared with cushions and refreshments, and Juncio found himself seated across from the ruler of one of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations, while a princess curled against his side and refused to move. "You must understand our customs," the queen said. "Among the Velothi, that is sacred. It is the foundation upon which our entire civilization is built. And a debt of life is the most sacred of all." Juncio nodded, though he was not certain he truly understood. My daughter's life is beyond price, the Queen continued. She is my youngest child, my unexpected blessing, the joy of my declining years, and you saved her when no one else would. When protocol and procedure and reasonable caution demanded that she be left to die, I could not leave her. Juncio said simply, "No." The Queen agreed. "You could not, and that is precisely what makes the debt so impossible to repay. Because you did not save her for reward or recognition or advancement. You saved her because it was right. And how does one repay someone who wants nothing?" Juncio felt the first stirring of unease in his stomach. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "I appreciate the honor of being brought here. But I have responsibilities. I have family on Earth who depend on me. I cannot simply abandon my life." The Queen's 6 eyes regarded him with something that might have been sympathy. "I understand," she said, "and I wish I could simply thank you and send you home with wealth and honors and the gratitude of my people. But I cannot. The debt demands more than that." "What does it demand?" Juncio asked. Though he feared he already knew the answer. "You saved a royal life," the Queen said. "By our ancient laws, you must remain here until the debt is satisfied. You will be given status and comfort and anything you desire. But you cannot leave until what you are owed has been repaid. And if the debt can never be repaid," Juncio said, his voice barely above a whisper, "then you cannot leave," the Queen replied. And her voice carried no cruelty, but also no compromise. "This is not punishment, Park Juncio. This is honor. The highest honor our civilization can bestow. And in time you will understand why." Kethrial looked up at him with her fractured compound eyes, and Juncio saw confusion there. The confusion of a child who did not understand why the adults were speaking of debts and laws when all she wanted was for her new friend to stay. "I am sorry," the Queen said, and she sounded like she meant it. "Your quarters have been prepared. You will want for nothing. And perhaps in time you will find peace here." Soldiers appeared to escort him, and Kethrial was gently pried from his side despite her protests. And Juncio walked through corridors of impossible beauty toward a gilded cage he had never asked for. His quarters were larger than any home he had ever known, furnished with comforts he could not name. And when the door closed behind him, he heard the unmistakable sound of locks engaging. He stood at the window and watched 3 alien moons rise over a world where he was now a treasured prisoner. And he wondered how an act of compassion had led him to a fate that felt very much like doom. Juncio woke in a medical pod with the taste of chemicals on his tongue and pain throbbing through every part of his body. And for a long moment, he could not remember where he was or why he felt like someone had dragged him through broken glass and fire. Then memory returned in fragments, and he saw again the child trapped beneath the rocks, and felt again the desperation that had driven him to dig with his bare hands until they bled. He tried to sit up and found that his body was not interested in cooperating. So he settled for turning his head to examine his surroundings. The medical bay looked different than he remembered, and it took him several seconds to realize that it was not the same medical bay at all. This room was larger and cleaner and filled with equipment that looked far more advanced than anything the mining colony possessed. And the walls were decorated with patterns that seemed to shift and shimmer when he looked at them directly. His supervisor, Hendrik, stood near the door with an expression on his face that Juncio had never seen before. Something between fear and awe that made the older man look 20 years younger and infinitely more uncertain. The colony administrator was there as well, a Korthan named Veldash, who usually carried himself with the confident authority of someone who knew exactly how the universe worked and his place within it. Today, Veldash looked like someone who had discovered that everything he thought he knew was wrong, but it was the other. Figures in the room that made Juncio's breath catch. In his throat, 6 Velothi soldiers stood in perfect formation near the walls, their ceremonial armor gleaming with colors that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the metal itself. And their compound eyes were fixed on Junseo with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under examination. "What is happening?" Junseo managed to say, and his voice came out rough and broken from the damage the toxic air had done to his throat. Hendrix opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, one of the Velati soldiers made a gesture, and the human fell silent with the look of a man who had been warned not to interfere. "You are Park Junseo," the soldier said, and her translator gave her words a flat mechanical quality that did not match the harmonic undertones of her actual voice. "You are the human who entered the collapsed tunnel in Section 7C and removed the trapped individual, the child," Junseo said, and he tried again to sit up because he needed to know. "Is she alive? Is she all right? Did she survive?" Something passed between the soldiers, a communication that happened in pheromones and subtle movements rather than words. And Junseo had the strange sense that he had surprised them somehow. "The princess is recovering fully," the soldier said. "Her injuries were severe but not beyond treatment, and she is expected to make a complete recovery thanks to your intervention." Junseo's mind caught on one word and refused to move past it. "Princess," he repeated, and the word sounded absurd in his damaged voice. "What do you mean, princess? You will receive a full explanation shortly," the soldier said. "For now you must prepare yourself. The queen wishes to speak with you directly." Junseo looked at Hendrix and saw no help there, looked at Veldash and saw only the same stunned uncertainty. And so he let the medical staff help him into a sitting position and accepted the robe they offered to cover his hospital gown. The soldiers escorted him through corridors that definitely did not belong to the mining colony, and Junseo realized with growing unease that he was on a ship, a vessel that had apparently arrived while he was unconscious, and that was now carrying him somewhere he had not agreed to go. They brought him to a communication chamber that was larger than his entire apartment back on Earth. And when the soldiers positioned him in the center of the room and stepped back, a holographic projection flickered to life before him. Queen Bellatrix filled the chamber with her presence. Even though she was countless light years away, she was enormous, far larger than any Velati Junseo had ever seen. And her chitin was a deep purple that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And her 6 compound eyes burned with an intelligence that made him feel very small and very young and very aware of his own limitations. Behind her stood thousands of Velati courtiers in perfect stillness, their bodies forming patterns that his human eyes could not quite parse into meaning. "Park Junseo of Earth," the queen said, and her voice resonated through the chamber in harmonics that his translator could only partially capture. "I have watched the recordings from the mining colony, and I have spoken with my daughter, and I have heard the reports from my soldiers, and I have one question for you." Junseo swallowed hard and tried to remember how to speak to royalty, but he had never met royalty before, and he had no idea what protocols applied when the royalty in question was an alien queen whose species he barely understood. "Why?" Queen Bellatrix asked, and the single word carried the weight of entire civilizations behind it. "Why did you risk your life for a child you did not know? A child who was not even of your species? A child whose survival meant nothing to your career, or your standing, or your future?" Junseo thought about the question, thought about the moment when he had heard that desperate cry and had made his choice without hesitation. And he found that the answer was very simple. "Because she was a child," he said. "Because she was afraid and hurt and dying, and because I could help. And because not helping was not something I could live with." The queen was silent for a long moment, her 6 eyes fixed on him with an intensity that seemed to pierce through his skin and examine whatever lay beneath. "You say this as though it is obvious," she said finally, as though any creature in your position would have done the same thing. I would like to believe that is true. Juncio said, "It is not true," the Queen replied. And there was something in her voice that might have been sorrow or anger or both. The tunnel was unstable, and the atmosphere was toxic, and protocol demanded that you wait for rescue teams. And every other worker on that colony followed protocol exactly as they were supposed to. And my daughter would have died if you had done the same. She leaned forward. And even though she was only a projection, Juncio felt the pressure of her attention like a physical weight. "You are the only one who chose to act," she said. "You are the only one who decided that a child's life was worth more than your own safety. And that is precisely the problem." Juncio did not understand what she meant, and his confusion must have shown on his face because the Queen made a gesture that his translator identified as something like grim amusement. "I am dispatching a royal vessel to bring you to my throne world," she said. "There is a debt between us now, Park Juncio, and it must be addressed properly according to the laws and customs of my people." "Your Majesty," Juncio said, "I am honored, but I have obligations here. I have a job and people who depend on me, and I cannot simply leave." The Queen's eyes flickered with something that might have been respect or might have been pity. "I'm afraid that was not a request," she said. And the projection flickered and died, and Juncio was left standing alone in the chamber with the terrible understanding that his life had just changed in ways he could not yet comprehend. The mining colony of Vethra 7 was not a place where anyone came to find happiness or purpose or meaning in their lives. And Park Juncio had accepted this truth during his very first week on the toxic rock that humanity's expansion had deemed valuable enough to inhabit. He worked as a maintenance engineer, which sounded important until you realized it meant crawling through access shafts filled with recycled air that always smelled faintly of chemicals and desperation. And it meant fixing life support systems that groaned under the strain of keeping thousands of workers alive in an environment that wanted nothing more than to kill them all. The colony existed as a network of pressurized domes connected by tunnels carved deep into poisonous stone. And Juncio knew these tunnels better than anyone because he spent his days inside them while other species worked the mines or managed the operations from comfortable offices. He was one of only 12 humans on the entire colony, and the other species often looked at him with something between curiosity and pity, as if wondering why any creature would choose such dangerous and thankless work when surely there were better options somewhere in the vast galaxy. But Juncio needed the money, and the hazard pay on Vethra 7 was substantial, and every credit he earned went back to Earth where his mother and younger sister depended on him to keep them housed and fed and hopeful about a future he was not certain he believed in anymore. On the day everything changed, he was performing a routine inspection of Tunnel 7C, a section of the colony that most workers avoided because the rock formations there were unstable and the air filtration systems were old and prone to failure. His scanner beeped warnings at him as he moved through the narrow passage, and he noted each one in his log with the tired efficiency of a man who had seen 1,000 minor problems and fixed them all without thanks or recognition. Then he heard the sound. It was high and thin and desperate, cutting through the mechanical hum of the life support systems like a blade through fabric. And Juncio stopped moving because he knew that sound even though he had never heard it before. Something was afraid, and something was hurt, and something was dying. He followed the sound deeper into the tunnel, ignoring the increasingly urgent warnings from his scanner. And when he rounded a corner, he found the collapsed section that his equipment had been trying to tell him about. Rocks and debris blocked most of the passage, but there was a gap near the bottom. And through that gap he could see movement and color that did not belong in this gray and lifeless place. Juncio dropped to his knees and looked through the opening, and his breath caught in his throat when he saw what was trapped on the other side. A young Velothi lay pinned beneath fallen debris. Her iridescent chitin cracked in several places, and her delicate wing membranes torn and bleeding a fluid that shimmered like liquid. Starlight in the dim emergency lighting, she was a child. That much was obvious, even though Juncio had limited experience with the insectoid species. And her forearms were pushing weakly against the rocks that held her down, while her compound eyes reflected terror in 1,000 fractured images. The air around her was thick with distress, pheromones that made Juncio's eyes water and his heart pound faster than it should. He checked his scanner and felt cold fear settle into his stomach when he saw the readings toxic. Atmosphere was leaking into the collapsed section through cracks in the tunnel wall, and the child's rebreather had been damaged in the collapse. And she had maybe 20 minutes before the poison in the air killed her. Protocol said he should report the situation immediately and wait for a HFY specialized rescue team to arrive with proper equipment and safety measures and all the careful procedures that kept workers alive on hostile worlds. But the rescue team would take at least 40 minutes to assemble and reach this location. And by then the child would be dead. Juncio made his choice without really thinking about it, because there was no choice to make when a child was dying in front of him. And he had hands that could dig and a rebreather that could keep her alive. He removed his own emergency rebreather and squeezed through the gap in the debris, feeling rocks scrape against his suit and tear small holes in the protective fabric. The child's eyes focused on him as he approached, and for a moment she seemed more afraid of him than of the rocks that trapped her. But then he pressed his rebreather to her face and showed her how to breathe through it, and her terror shifted into something like desperate hope. "Hold on," he said, even though he was not sure if she could understand human speech. And he began to dig. The rocks tore at his gloves, and then at his bare hands when the gloves gave out, and his skin blistered and bled as the toxic elements in the stone reacted with his flesh. He kept digging. His suit's integrity warnings screamed at him as more tears opened in the fabric, and he could feel the poisoned air beginning to seep through and burn his lungs with every breath. He kept digging. The child watched him with those fractured, compound eyes, holding the rebreather to her face with two of her arms while the other two reached toward him as if she wanted to help but did not know how. Juncio freed her legs first, then carefully lifted the largest piece of debris from her torso. And when she was finally loose, he gathered her into his arms and turned toward the gap in the rubble. His vision was starting to blur from the toxins, and his hands felt like they were on fire, and every breath sent sharp pain through his chest. But the child was light in his arms, lighter than he had expected, and her forearms wrapped around his neck and held on with the fierce determination of someone who had decided to trust him completely. He squeezed back through the gap, feeling more rocks tear at his damaged suit. And then he was running through the tunnel with alarms blaring all around him, and the child pressed against his chest. The medical bay was 3 sections away, and Juncio did not remember most of the journey. Only the burning in his lungs and the weight of the child in his arms, and the desperate need to keep moving forward. When he finally burst through the medical bay doors, there were shouts and rushing bodies and hands that tried to take the child from him. He let her go only when he saw that she was being placed on a treatment table, and only when he saw the medical staff surrounding her with equipment and expertise that would keep her alive. Then his legs gave out and the world tilted sideways, and he was falling. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was a crowd of Velothi workers gathering around the child, their movements reverent and their voices rising in harmonics that sounded almost like prayer. Someone was screaming words that his translator struggled to process, and the last thing he heard before consciousness left him was a phrase that made no sense at all. The princess. Someone was shouting. Someone has saved the princess? And then there was nothing but darkness and the distant echo of his own heartbeat slowing down.